Nothing means anything on its own. It only means something because of what surrounds it. Strip the context and you've changed the meaning, even if the words stayed exactly the same. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations. So please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. So if you've listened to every episode, or at least most of them in this season, you might have wondered at some point why I tell you so many personal stories, why I give you so much background, why I reference the specificities in my life, when I could just make the point directly and move on. And the reason is context. And that's exactly what this episode is about. Because as the title says, context changes everything. And I mean that not just as a general observation about life, but as the specific structural reason this podcast works the way it does. Every story I've told, every anecdote, every reference, every piece of backstory, that's all context. And without it, I don't think what I'm saying would hit the same way. It might not even hit at all. It might make no sense whatsoever. I want to make this personal because I think the clearest demonstration of what I mean is actually this podcast itself. So yes, every episode I've shared very specific things. Specific memories, specific people, specific moments from my childhood and my education and specific places, creators I follow, musicians I love, films I watched as a kid, words that stuck with me, moments I can still feel in my body. And if you have been following along, you've been accumulating all of that. Building a picture of who I am from everything I've chosen to share. And I talked about in the previous episode about parasocial relationships and how the specific details a creator shares builds a version of them in the listener's head. And that's true for this podcast too. Every time I mention 5 Seconds of Summer or Jackie Aina or one of the other creators that I've talked about, or the fact that I grew up speaking Russian at home, or that I wrote a 193,000 word fanfiction and felt ashamed of it for years, I'm giving you context about who I am. And that context is what makes everything else I say hit and land differently than it would if I were just making observations in the abstract. If I'd said in episode 1, self-awareness can be lonely, you might have heard it and just moved on. But because you now know about the dot outside the circle and the insular community and the years of feeling like an outcast from the outcasts and the grade that made me sink to the floor behind a bar and all of it, that same statement means something different. The context accumulated across every episode is what gives the thesis its weight. And that's not an accident. That's context doing exactly what it always does. And like a few other things that I've talked about in previous episodes, like fear, for example, context is another invisible thread running through every single episode I've made and will run through every single future episode I make. And I think it's one of the most important factors in self-awareness and also one of the least talked about. So I wanted to give it its own space. And this connects back to episode 1 more directly than it might seem. Why does self-awareness suck? Well, one of the most specific reasons is this. Once you understand how context works, you can never hear anything neutrally again. Every word someone says to you, you're now tracking the context underneath. Every comment has layers you automatically start reading. The skill that should make communication easier makes it almost impossible to receive anything at face value. And that's the episode 1 thesis made specific. And that's what I want to talk about in detail today. And as you may know, I've mentioned across several episodes that studying English from secondary school all the way through to university gave me a particular way of looking at language. And one of the most fundamental things I was taught, one of the things that underpins almost everything else, is the difference between connotation and denotation. Now, denotation is the literal dictionary definition of a word. The factual, neutral meaning. The thing the word actually says. Connotation, however, is everything else. The emotional weight it carries, the associations it triggers, the cultural baggage, the personal history, the tone, the context in which it's usually used. All of it. The feeling the word gives you beyond what it technically means. Let me give you an example. Take the word home. The denotation is simple. A place where someone lives. That's it. But the connotations, well, for one person, home might mean warmth, safety, family, comfort, stability, and a place to go that makes you feel comfortable. For another, it may mean tension, obligation, a place they needed to escape. For someone who grew up moving constantly, it might feel like an unstable concept entirely. So it's the same word, but a completely different weight, depending on who's holding it. And that's connotation. And it's why two people can hear the exact same sentence and walk away with entirely different experiences of it. And it's worth pointing out that this isn't just a theoretical observation. The same situation can produce completely different responses in different people because of the context each person brings to it. The same conversation can feel routine to one person and genuinely threatening to another. Not because the words were different, but because the personal history underneath the words was. Same denotation, completely different connotation. And I think this is part of why the fear profiles I talked about in episode 11, anticipatory dread, performance fear, conflict sharpening, are so individual. The trigger might look the same from the outside. What it means to the person experiencing it never is. And there's a whole layer of this that lives entirely outside the words themselves. And I've talked about this before, but I wanted to bring it back here because it's actually really relevant to today's topic of context. During my master's, I spent a lot of time on studying something called paralinguistic features. All the non-verbal information that travels alongside language. So tone, pitch, the pace at which something is said, the pause before or after it, and even the facial expression that accompanies it. These are all doing enormous amounts of contextual work in face-to-face communication. And when they're absent, as they are in text, in posts, in comments, the meaning doesn't just become ambiguous, it becomes genuinely unpredictable. Because the reader fills in the paralinguistic gap with their own assumptions, which is why text-based communication produces so many more misunderstandings than conversation. The words are there, but the context that was carrying them isn't. And this used to fascinate me when I was studying, and I remember a specific thought forming, and I'm pretty sure it was during college, and I was probably in the shower because that's when the brain tends to do its best work. That's when we start to come up with all sorts of ideas if we're not singing along to something. But at the time, of course, since school, I'd been doing a lot of reading across both history and English. And I kept noticing how the same text, the same event, the same word could produce completely different interpretations depending on who was analysing it. Secondary texts written about the same novel, but fundamentally disagreeing on what they found. Historians looking at the same period and reaching opposite conclusions. Even in class, everyone had a different association to whatever it was we were studying. And I couldn't stop thinking about what that actually meant. And this theory popped up in my head. So imagine a pair of identical twins. Same genetics, same household, same parents, same community, same school, same friend group. You give them both the same word and ask them to map out every connotation they can think of. Every association, every feeling, every connection, anything that possibly could come to mind. And it is likely that they would come back with two completely different maps. Because no two brains work on the same frequency. No two people process experience at the same pace or through the same filter. Even in the most identical circumstances imaginable, the individual experience is never actually identical. And that means every single word you say is going to sit somewhere slightly different in every person who hears it. The word leaves your mouth with one context attached, but it arrives with another one entirely. And I think that's why it feels so extra special when you and another person, your best friend, your sibling, whoever, you might say the same word at the same time, or you might have the exact same opinion about something, or you've felt the exact same way about something you've watched or experienced. Because I think that most of the time we are experiencing everything at completely different frequencies, at completely different paces, and in completely different interpretations. But it's not a problem to be solved. It's just the reality of how life and language works. But once you understand it, you start to see why context and the surrounding information that helps the listener calibrate their interpretation is not optional. It's an essential, and it's the only thing standing between what you meant and what someone heard. And I just want to elaborate a little bit more on the specific way I got to this theory, because it was of how I was taught in school. So let me build you a picture so you know where I'm coming from. Give you the context. So what we would do in English classes, particularly at high school, is we would take a single word from a text and shred it completely. Now, this could have been a fictional text or non-fictional, so newspapers and magazines, and we'd look at their headlines and the images associated to them. And we would look at every single possible connotation, every association, every chain of meaning. And then we do the same for the connotations of those connotations. And it would turn into this enormous mind map radiating outward from just one word. And we would have to then maybe relate it to the imagery that we might have had if it was an article. But the skill was in taking those sometimes very tenuous, very far-reaching connections and argue them back into the text, and showing how they were supported by the language around them, the narrative context, the historical period, the author's own life and circumstances. And this is where historical and social context always came in. Like many, we studied Charles Dickens and we studied Shakespeare. And one thing that was constant across all of it was this: you cannot read the text without reading the world it was written in. Specifically, an example was the attitudes toward women in Dickens's time versus Shakespeare's time. They are completely different, and yet both shaped how their female characters were written. And I remember that we had to do an essay where we compared Miss Havisham from Great Expectations and Lady Macbeth from Macbeth. Two women separated by centuries, and yet we found the same threads underneath both of them because the social context, the fear of women who operated outside the prescribed roles, was consistent across both eras. And to an extent, the context didn't just inform the text, it produced it. And I think that principle applies everywhere. Not just in literature, but in every conversation you've ever had, in every piece of media you've ever consumed, in every interaction, every relationship, every misunderstanding. Context is always producing the meaning. And something else that I've talked about previously is how in conflict or in difficult conversations, I go very quiet. And it's because my brain is doing the most work. And part of what it's doing is reading context, trying to understand where the other person is coming from, what's underneath what they're saying, what their own connotation map might look like for the words they've just used. And that instinct to hold the other person's context alongside my own before I respond was something I developed not that long ago. I just knew somewhere that the same sentence can mean completely different things depending on who's saying it and where they're coming from. Conflict is just connotation made personal. Two people bringing completely different maps to the same conversation and wondering why they can't find common ground. But going back to society and culture producing meaning and being a large part of context, one of the clearest examples of this in everyday life that I always seem to come back to is the description of someone or something being nerdy. In the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, maybe even the 2010s, being called nerdy was an insult. It meant that you were undesirable, uncool, an outsider. We've seen this in countless representations. The Big Bang Theory, for example, that was an entire TV show centered around nerds who are deemed outcasts because of their interests, but partially also because of their intellect. And we've seen the trope in hundreds of rom-coms. But being called nerdy and the association of being undesirable and uncool wasn't inherent to the word. It was a connotation produced by the culture at the time and reinforced endlessly through media and TV shows and films, all of which kept associating nerdiness with social failure, with being unwanted, with needing a makeover to be acceptable. And the word carried that weight because the culture kept loading it in. And I would say that now, in 2026, being called nerdy reads very differently. I think we're at a stage now where it can actually be a compliment, but it can also be neutral. But the thing is, the word hasn't changed. It's just that the context around it has, because the culture around it has, and because enough people pushed back on the narrative that was being loaded in. And this is exactly what episode 5 was about underneath the surface. You know, to be cringe is to be free. You know, cringe isn't a fixed quality. It's a context-dependent verdict. What's cringe in one room, one era, or one social hierarchy is iconic in another. And the nerdy example is doing the same thing. The thing that marked you as an outsider in one context becomes the thing that makes you interesting in the next. But the word didn't change. The room did. And I think that shift happened through what I talked about in the last episode, the exposure therapy element of collective self-expression, the recontextualization of things that used to be shameful. The culture changed the weight of the word, which I think is actually a hopeful thing if you sit with it, because it means the meaning of things is not fixed. It's produced and it can be changed. And this brings me to the words I've been circling around all season without giving them a proper examination. You know, the ones from school that I have mentioned many a time, being called fat and ugly and weird and boring and annoying. But on a purely denotative level, those words are just descriptors. Fat is a neutral biological term. Ugly is a subjective aesthetic judgment that varies wildly across cultures and centuries. Weird just means different from what's expected, which is itself entirely dependent on what the norm is in a given context. None of them are inherently catastrophic. None of them are inherently anything. But what made them catastrophic was everything that surrounded them. The age I was when I first heard them applied to me, some as young as 7. The social context of a very small, again very insular community where the hierarchy was fixed and everyone knew everyone and there was no real escape from whatever version of you had been decided on by the group. The specific cultural moment, the early 2000s, when beauty standards for women and girls were genuinely extreme, when thinness was the only acceptable body, when being visibly different was a liability rather than an asset. And the specific people who said them, boys specifically, whose opinions had been culturally positioned as the most authoritative measure of a girl's worth. And the fact that they were said repeatedly, consistently, over years, until they stopped being things someone had said to me and started feeling like things that were just simply true. But strip all of that context away and they are just words. But I didn't live outside that context. I lived inside it, and many of us did. And inside it, those words were catastrophic. Not because of what they meant in a dictionary, but because of what they meant in that room at that time to that version of me who had nothing else to compare them against. And you know that phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I think that the sticks and stones idea only works in a vacuum. And no one lives in a vacuum. And no one was going to go back and restore the context that got stripped out of those words when they lodged themselves in my memory. That work was mine to do, which is episode 3, realization in a different form. You know, no one is coming to do it for you. The excavation of context, of understanding why something hit so hard and whether that context was ever the whole truth, that's internal work that doesn't happen unless you make it happen. And here's where that connects to something called semantic satiation, which I want to give proper space to here. And it's a phenomenon that I am obsessed with. I find it fascinating, and I think that it can apply to more than just words. And it can sometimes be called semantic saturation. And hopefully that might help with understanding the meaning of it if you've never come across it before. But semantic satiation is what happens when you repeat a word or phrase so many times that it starts to lose its meaning. your brain processes it so many times in quick succession that the connection between the sound and its significance starts to disconnect. And the word becomes just sound, just noise, and it stops carrying any weight and it becomes overly saturated. And I think this works in, like I said, more directions than the term usually implies. You can repeat something positive until it becomes an affirmation, until your brain starts to accept it as true rather than aspirational. And that's the mechanism behind the daily affirmations I talked about in episode 12. Repetition shifting what something means over time. And you can repeat something negative until it also loses its power, until it stops being something that hits you and starts being just a sound someone made once. And I've talked about the boring comment someone made to me in previous episodes, and particularly in episode 6. Long story short, someone called me boring, and I took that comment and ran with it for far longer than I should have done. And initially, I repeated it to myself so many times that I believed it as fact, and then started using confirmation bias to build evidence for it. But then at some point, and not that long ago, I repeated it to myself so many times and examined it so many times that it just started to sound ridiculous and ring hollow. And then I could start to reject it, not out of defensiveness, but out of genuine disbelief. Because I'd repeated it until I could hear how illogical it was. And then on top of that, I started doing things in practice to prove to myself that I'm not boring and to counteract the narrative I'd believed for far too long. Doing things as simple as getting out of the house and doing things that I enjoyed, and even doing things that might be considered cringe or embarrassing. Which goes back to what I talked about in episode 4 about how free will is reason enough. The moment I chose to run the repetition differently, to stop feeding the boring story and start feeding a different one, that was a free will decision. I didn't need permission to reframe it, I just had to choose to. And choosing to is the whole point. But the risk is also real. Repetition can entrench things as much as it can dissolve them. Confirmation bias is essentially semantic satiation running in the wrong direction, repeating a negative story about yourself until it becomes so familiar that it feels true. So the awareness matters, because the repetition is going to happen either way. The question is which direction you're choosing to let it run. But there's something important in how context collapse works in memory. Again, that boring comment that I've talked about several times now is a perfect example. When it was said to me, it was said in a very specific context. At the time, I didn't want to do something. And so that person said, "Oh, don't be boring." And that word, that phrase, came out as a response to that specific moment. But for me, the context of the moment didn't travel with the word when I stored it. What I stored was the word and the feeling it gave me and my interpretation of what it meant about me. The context stripped away in the transfer, and suddenly a situational comment became a personality verdict. And this happens all the time in both directions. Words get decontextualized in memory. Compliments have a smaller impact than they should because they get separated from the warmth of the moment they arrived in. Similarly, criticisms hit harder because they get separated from the circumstances that produced them. And what you're left with is just the word with all the weight and none of the surrounding information that would help you calibrate it. So this is why telling the full story matters. And it's why I give you the backstory, the childhood, the specific memories, because I'm trying to give you the context that would otherwise get stripped out. I'm trying to make sure that when something resonates, it does so with its full meaning rather than just its loudest one. And once again, episode 6 comes up here. The problem with being perceived, which I think is really a context problem at its core. When someone forms an opinion of you without the full picture, they're working with stripped context. They see a fragment of you and build a version from it. That version feels real to them even though it's built from incomplete information. Which is why I go into so much detail on this podcast, because I am trying to give you enough context that the version you build of me is at least closer to accurate than it would be if I just made the observations without the backstory. And I think that interestingly, the white lies I talked about in episode 2 were doing the same thing, just in reverse. I was managing the context before someone else could strip it, controlling the information available so that the interpretation I received would be the one I'd intended, rather than whatever someone would have produced if left to fill in the gaps themselves. And there is something that I want to bring up here, and I'm going to say it carefully because it relates to the digital world and how context works or fails to work online. And I talked about my fear of the digital footprint. The awareness that everything I say online exists in a context I can't fully control and can be encountered by someone in a completely different context from the one it was created in. A joke that makes sense in one conversation doesn't in the same way when it's screenshotted and posted somewhere else. A statement that makes complete sense with a longer version and longer conversation sounds very different as a single extracted quote. The context is travelling badly in this scenario. And I think that this is why old posts, when they resurface, they cause problems. Not always because the person who made them is unchanged, sometimes because the context of the world has changed so substantially that words which were unremarkable in one era read completely differently in another. The early internet had no etiquette around this, no awareness of digital footprint. There was no sense that what you were saying in what felt like a private or casual context could persist and be encountered by completely different people in completely different contexts years later. There was no idea that posts put on social media would be used against you in the future because of a mass realization that certain words and behaviours aren't acceptable anymore. And I'm not excusing the posts people put out in the past or the harm they caused, not at all. But I do think that context is a huge part of a reading of the situations, because I think that stripping the context is itself a choice that shapes the meaning. Anyway, I said before that I would come back to the Australia example properly, so let me just do that now. The grades I got in Australia weren't measuring my ability any differently than the grades I got in my final year, and I talked about this at length in episode 13. The work was produced by the same person with the same skills, but the context around the marking was completely different. Different expectations, different grade boundaries, grades that didn't even count towards my final result, which meant the pressure was completely different. It was the same work, different context, and a completely different meaning. And what felt like evidence that I'd found my footing again was actually evidence that context was doing most of the heavy lifting. But I just didn't understand that at the time. Which is why when the context changed again, when I came back for my final year with time and space to study and still got grades that disappointed me, it felt like a verdict. But it wasn't. It was another context producing another set of numbers. And speaking of context and what things mean, depending on where you are, another thing that I've talked about at length is my heritage throughout this season. About being half Russian, half British, and growing up in this very closed, small community where almost everyone had known everyone since they were 4 years old. And in that environment, I felt as though my background was genuinely distinctive. Not many people had grown up speaking 2 languages at home, or at least as far as I'm aware. And not many of them had family traditions and foods and a whole other cultural world living inside the house that nobody outside could see. And that made me feel special, even when it also made me feel other. And connected to this, which I've also talked about before, was how when I went to university, suddenly I was in institutions with much larger and much more international populations, and suddenly I didn't feel special anymore. Everyone had their own whole other world inside their upbringing. Everyone had their own version of being between cultures, between places, between ways of living. The thing that had felt rare and distinctive in one context was basically completely unremarkable in another. Same identity, completely different context, completely different meaning. But I think in hindsight, this was actually one of the better moments of my life, even though it sounds like it could be deflating. Because what it meant was that the otherness I'd been carrying, the sense of being the one with the unusual background in a room full of people who all knew each other and shared references I didn't, that was a context-specific experience. Not a fixed truth about who I was. It only felt that way because of the size and composition of the room I was in. Change the room, and the meaning changes completely. So yes, when I look back across this season, I can see that almost every episode has actually been about context, just from a different angle. If we go back to shadow work in episode 8, it's all about finding context through excavation. When I traced the white lies back to where they started, and when I connected the fitness avoidance to the belief that I wasn't someone who exercised, when I found the Wikipedia belief underneath the need to be remarkable, I was finding the context behind my own behaviour. The shadow isn't just hidden material. It's behaviour that's been running without context, without you knowing where it came from or why. And shadow work gives it context, and once something has context, it stops running automatically. It stops having power over you because you can look at it and choose what to do with it, and it's not something that just happens to you anymore. And then in episode 9, finding language for yourself is finding context through words. When I found the term diaspora or double identity, or when the affect labelling thing clicked, what I actually found was context for something I'd been experiencing without being able to place it. The experience didn't change, the context around it did. And that changed everything about what I could do with it. And in episode 10, about self-censorship, it's what happens when you're afraid of context being stripped away. It's the reason I overthink every word I post online. The reason the digital footprint fear runs so persistently in the background is because I know that context can travel badly. That something said in one context encountered in another means something completely different. The self-censorship is a protective response to that, a way of trying to future-proof the context before it gets lost. So, many different episodes, but the same underlying mechanism, and context is always the thing underneath. And here's the thing that ties all of this back to self-awareness specifically. Once you understand how context works, how completely it shapes meaning, how different every person's connotation map is from every other person's, you become acutely aware of how little control you have over how you're received. You can be as precise as possible, as careful as possible, as thorough as possible in the context you provide. And yet someone will still read something different in what you said than what you meant. Because they're bringing their own context, their own connotation map, their own history, their own frequency. And that is why self-awareness sucks. The skill that should help you communicate better also shows you very clearly the limits of how well you can ever really communicate. You can get closer to being understood, but you can never fully close the gap because the gap is structural. It's built into how language works. It's built into how differently two identical twins can map the same word. And this is actually what the next episode is about. What do you do with that? When you understand how unlikely full understanding is, when you've given all the context you can give and someone still reads you wrong, when the gap exists not because you failed to communicate, but because the gap is always there, what do? You let yourself be misunderstood. That's the whole conversation, and I'll have it in the next episode. But before I do, I want to say one more thing. The experiences I've talked about across this season, being bullied, not fitting in, being called boring, feeling other because of my heritage, hiding the things I loved because they weren't acceptable in the context I was in, all of that happened in specific contexts. Small communities with specific hierarchies, specific cultural moments with specific beauty standards, specific schools with specific unspoken rules about who was allowed to be what. Here's what I've learned about context. It can change. The room can get bigger. The culture can shift. The word that was an insult can become a compliment. And the thing you were mocked for in one room can be the thing that makes you remarkable in another. That doesn't erase the original experience. But it does mean the original experience wasn't a verdict. It was a context. And contexts change. So this episode's Uncomfortably Honest is this. 4 years, I absorbed the context of other people's opinions about me as if it were fact. The specific comments, the specific dynamics, the specific environment of a very small and insular community felt like universal truth. Like that was just what I was. And it took expanding the context, going to bigger institutions, meeting more people, encountering frameworks that gave me different language from my own experience, to understand that I had been mistaking a context for a conclusion. The boring comment didn't mean I was boring. The bullying didn't mean I was what they said I was. It meant I was those things in that context to those people in that moment. And that context was never the whole picture. It was just the only picture I had access to at the time. So here's what I want to leave you with. What's something you've been carrying as a conclusion that might actually just be a context? Something that felt like a verdict on who you are, but was actually just one room, one moment, one set of people, one particular point in time. Because the room can change. And when it does, what that thing means changes with it. If what I've talked about today resonated, I think that you might find episode 9 interesting, when language gives you a mirror. It's where I get into how finding the right words for your own experience can completely change what you're able to do with it. And it connects directly to everything we've covered today. And if you want to be here for the next one, hitting follow or subscribe means you won't miss it. there are new episodes every week. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!